Good afternoon and welcome to this Policy Insights live event brought to you by the Centre for Public Policy. I'm Kezia Dugdale, your host for the next 45 minutes or so, and I'm the Associate Director of the Centre, which is proudly based at the University of Glasgow. We exist to build collaboration between research and policy communities, and we do that through sharing evidence, nurturing skills, and creating spaces for fresh thinking. Today's event does exactly that, bringing together leaders from across Scotland's civic life to reflect on the general election campaign so far. Joining us for Policy Insights Live, I'm delighted to welcome Anna Fowlie, Chief Executive of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, Nathalie Agnew from the Institute of Directors, and Dr. Emily Gray, from the Managing Director of Ipsos in Scotland. And of course, our very own Centre Director and leading political scientist, Professor Nicola McEwen. I'll start the conversation off with some key questions for our guests, but you can get involved throughout the event by adding your own comments and questions through the comment box on the right-hand side of your screen. Emily, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, as our polling guru. What do we know about voters' top priority issues in this election, and how much does that vary by, say, age or geography or gender across the United Kingdom?
Sure. I mean, what we're seeing so far is that this is shaping up to be a public services election. So the NHS is the number one issue that's impacting how voters say they will vote come the 4th of July. And that actually is consistent across age groups and for women and men. And the big reason for that is that the public are really dissatisfied with the state of the public services. So we've seen a huge decline in satisfaction, actually, and 3 in 4 people think that services have got worse in the last 5 years. But the other big issues across the UK are immigration and the economy and the cost of living. And importantly for the Labour and the Conservatives, actually Labour of the two is perceived to be the best party on the issues that matter most to voters just now.
I feel like I've been inundated with polls over the past few days to the extent I've lost a little bit of a sense of the overall trends in the direction of travel. Can you give us a quick state of the race, so to speak, the current polling position of the parties across the United Kingdom, but also here in Scotland, and how much that's changed since the general election was called?
Sure. I mean, UK-wide, the truth is that there's been very little movement in terms of Labour and the Conservatives' positions since back at the start of the campaign, or even before, actually. So Labour's average lead since the election was called is 21 points over the Conservatives. That's exactly the same as their average lead the month before the election was called. But I think the question from here in is that will the Labour and Conservative share of the vote get squeezed further? So, of course, one thing to watch is Reform UK's numbers, because they've improved at the expense of, well, both the big parties, but also but particularly the Conservatives. And in Scotland, the story looks very different. So it's looking like a much tighter race. And actually, polls taken earlier in the campaign were showing a Labour lead of anywhere between 4 and 10 points over the SNP. But then polls taken over the last week or so have put SNP and Labour a bit closer. So I think the big question, of course, is how many seats Labour can take from the SNP, particularly across the central belt, or do the SNP just manage to hang on to those? And finally, on Scotland, it's worth saying things are looking very bad for the Conservatives. So recent polls put them on 14% of the vote, and that's a lot lower than the 25% they won back at the last election in 2019.
And given that the Conservative support is quite concentrated in different parts of the country, can we draw any conclusions yet about what that might mean in seats, Emily?
I think what's going to be really important to watch on election night is what happens in the northeast of Scotland and in the borders, in those contests where it's directly between the SNP and the Conservatives, including, and of course, in the Aberdeenshire North and Moray East, where Douglas Ross is contesting his seat. But I think the thing is with Scotland, over a third of the seats are marginal, so even quite small movements in vote share or a really well fought local campaign can make the difference. So it's much harder for pollsters to predict compared to the situation UK wide just now.
Thank you. It's a great overview of the sort of state of the race. Coming to you, Nicola, you have vast experience of studying and analysing elections. From your perspective, what are the hallmarks of this particular election?
So you're telling me I have vast experience is another way of saying you've been around a bit?
It's a very gentle way of doing it.
So, I mean, I think in some ways, this election has the feel of 1997, where the Blair government swept to power with a massive majority of 178 seats at that time, after 18 years of Conservative rule. So it feels a little bit like a moment like that, where we are expecting, after 14 years of Conservative-led government, the Labour Party, every opinion poll suggesting that the Labour Party is going to sweep into power again, possibly with an even bigger majority than that. Of course, there's still weeks to go, and we can't predict for sure what the outcomes will be, but certainly there's no surprise to suggest that Labour are going to win a majority government. But there are some big differences as well. First of all, I think in this case, because of pressure on its right flank from reform, this election feels a bit more like an existential threat for the Conservative Party. And what happens after the election? Does that party implode? Is it potentially in time supplanted by the Reform Party? We just don't know. So it feels like there's much more at stake for the Conservatives than just facing an election defeat, although that in itself is a pretty big issue for any party to confront. The other big difference from 1997, of course, is that we have devolution now, and in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's always a wee bit separate because of the completely different party system. But certainly, if we think about Scotland here, we have devolution. The SNP is much more dominant force now than it was in 1997. Maybe not quite as dominant as it was in the last few general elections, though. It's been a difficult campaign for the SNP, difficult in part because it's got its own record to defend in government, in part because of the party's internal challenges, which are numerous, and also because there is so much focus on the UK contest in this election. And sometimes that is the case, but in the last few, there's been almost like a different kind of election in Scotland. It doesn't feel like that this time, and it's quite difficult for the SNP to sort of put a Scottish stamp on it, if you like, when the focus is so much about a change of government at Westminster.
I'll come back to you in a second, Nicola, actually, and explore that theme of how devolution is playing out through the general election campaign in a moment or two. But let me bring in Anna and Nathalie as well. Anna, perhaps starting with you, what's been the dominant theme of this election from your perspective, and what's so far been ignored or lacked its moment in the spotlight that probably really deserves it?
Well, I think from my perspective, it's devolved issues have dominated, and that's even devolved beyond the Parliament to Council. Sometimes it's issues that are a matter for local government that people are talking about, and that really, I suppose, was backed up by what Emily said there about the NHS, which obviously is a devolved issue. And I understand that most of the electorate are in England, and it's relevant for the vast majority of the electorate. But even the Scottish representatives for Westminster are not talking about why the Westminster elections actually matter here in Scotland. And even if you listen to the vox pops on the radio with Scottish voters, they're all talking about the state of their high streets or the NHS, and not the economy, not social security, the big things that actually make a huge difference here in Scotland and communities. But then, to quote Paul Weller, the public wants what the public gets. So it's a vicious circle, because you play to what the public want, but then the public wants what you tell them about. So it's a really difficult one. But I think it's really important for us to remember that poverty and increasing inequalities impact on everybody. So that could be directly on people who experience it, but also on all of us, where public funds and charitable funds as well, from our perspective, are spent on mitigating the harm that's been caused by failed public policy at a Westminster level, rather than on building stronger communities. And I suppose the other thing that kind of gets me down a bit is when we hear about all parties saying, well, at least we'll not be as bad as them. And to me, that's a low bar. And it's really similar to that, what we hear in Scottish politics, well, at least we're not as bad as England. I think we should be striving for a bit better than not the least worst.
Yeah, a tiny bit more aspiration than that would be welcome for sure. Nathalie, you're our voice today for the business community. We have had a decent amount of a conversation about the economy, or at least the role of economic growth and wealth creation. What do you think about what you've heard so far? Is that a dominant theme from your perspective, or what would you rather we were talking about at the moment as a country?
Yeah, economy and economic growth are absolutely the core themes. So at the Institute of Directors in Scotland, we represent directors, aspiring directors and entrepreneurs. And what we're hearing from them is that they really want a policy framework that's stable, it's light touch, and it's really focused on the long term. We know that growth is the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity as well, because currently the economy is stuck in a rut of weak business confidence, inadequate investment, we have poor productivity, and we're not seeing growth in that productivity. If we could drive higher rates of sustainable economic growth, then that's going to support public finance. And I've heard Kate Forbes, Anna Sarwar and other leaders in the business community in recent weeks at hustings and conferences talking about their focus areas, and they do seem very aligned, and it does feel like all the parties are putting forward that economic growth is critical, and that if you can grow the economy, that's going to grow the public purse, and in turn, that's what's needed in order to fund any other policy area across the spectrum, really.
Anna, can I maybe just come back to you on that one, because that's the big if, is it not? This goal for economic growth. What if we don't get it? What does that mean in terms of the future of public services and for the broad social security agenda that you want to see enhanced?
Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial, and the thing to remember is that the economy, and a thriving economy across the UK, is dependent not just on the business sector, well, that's really important. And our sector, for example, in Scotland alone, charities and the voluntary sector, social enterprises contribute over £9 billion and employ nearly 140,000 people. So those are people who are spending money in our economy. So it's absolutely vital that we see that kind of that inclusive growth. And I still get disappointed that we focus on GDP, which, if you remember, GDP includes the proceeds of crime, but it doesn't include recognising unpaid carers, for example. So for me, it's an outdated measure, but the economic growth is good for everybody, as long as it's a kind of inclusive, fair economic growth.
Thank you. And Nicola, if I can bring you back in here just to reflect on last week, which was the UK manifesto week, and we're expecting this to be the week where Scottish manifestos are released, and in particular we'll see the SNP's first outlay of their platform on Wednesday. What in 2024 is the purpose of a Scottish manifesto, and what do we know so far from these party platforms about the future of devolution itself?
So, I mean, I think we saw that the Scottish Liberal Democrats have launched their manifesto this morning. It wasn't up on their website before I joined, but what I would expect from the manifestos of the UK parties is a translation. So, as Anna was saying, a lot of the manifestos and the focus has been on issues that in Scotland and Wales are devolved. So the money comes from spending commitments through the Barnett formula, what are called Barnett consequentials, but it's for the Scottish Government to choose how to allocate that. So I think what we'll see is the parties saying what they would do and making those commitments were they to be in charge of government in Scotland, but also with blooding that message slightly, but also focusing on some of the UK-wide issues. And what's been striking for me from the UK parties in Scotland is the extent to which they're also using this election to pass judgment on the government within Scotland, even though there is nothing in this election that would change the government in Scotland. It's a UK general election for a UK parliament, but it's an opportunity to almost sort of rehearse some of the arguments that will come in the Scottish Parliament elections in 2 years' time. What I expect of devolution? I mean, devolution and the devolution settlement, although that's about Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, constitutionally, in terms of where the responsibility lies, that principally lies with the UK Parliament. I would hope that there would be an opportunity to reset some of the relationships that have been very difficult in the last few years. There maybe wasn't quite as much in the manifestos that we saw last week to inspire confidence in that regard. So, for example, there've been lots of calls, particularly from lawyers, for something like the Sewell Convention, which is the convention that the UK Parliament won't normally legislate on devolved matters without the consent of the devolved governments. Really, really important founding principle of devolution. And that has been eroded somewhat in the last few years. And there was hope that there might be a legal underpinning to strengthen that. The Labour manifesto talked about a memorandum of understanding. So it does seem that a lot will still rely upon goodwill and good relationships and rebuilding trust rather than anything more formal. We might get that, but it will take effort, mutual effort, and well, we shall see.
We also had an indication from Labour's manifesto that we could anticipate or expect a beefed up Scotland office that would have spending powers. What might that do to the relationship with the UK government and the Scottish government, do you think?
So, in a sense, it may depend on who runs it, who occupies the office of the Secretary of State for Scotland, and whether that person is minded to be cooperative with the Scottish government or whether they are minded to compete with the Scottish government, as we have seen over the last few years. But I think it is absolutely contentious, and it does seem to me to suggest that some of the things that have caused difficulty, the use of spending powers in devolved areas, for example, will continue and possibly even be amplified under the Labour government. And that's unlikely to make for a harmonious relationship.
Emily, can I bring you in on that? What do we understand or know about what voters think about these dynamics, and in particular, how much they see and hear public policy through that devolution lens, and who the respective speakers are in each instance?
Yeah, it's a really mixed picture. So as Anna referred to, you know, the top issues for Scottish voters at this election, actually that includes devolved issues like the NHS and education. So when we actually put this question to the Scottish public in our most recent Ipsos polls, so we asked whether they would cast their vote mainly according to what was going on in Scotland, what was going across on in Britain, or both equally. And again, it just really split. So 39% said it's about what's going on in Britain, 33% about what's going on in Scotland, and 27% both equally. So it's that real mix. But I think you also need to look at like the overarching narrative of the election as well. And what voters have been telling us actually for a long time now is that they are keen to see change. And so there is, just overwhelming agreement, both that the UK needs a fresh team of leaders, but also that Scotland does as well. So I guess it's not, there's this general election, but also thinking ahead to the next Holyrood elections in 2026 as well.
And Nathalie, just going back to this being Scottish Manifesto Week, trying to get my head around, thinking about policies which drive economic growth and drive wealth creation, aspects of it which are reserved, aspects of it which are devolved. What is the business community looking to the parties for this week from the Scottish manifestos that might help with that overall goal?
Yeah, so I think at a UK level, we have a really highly respected governance framework in the UK, and that follows through into Scotland. What we're hearing from members is they're really looking for evidence-based policy decisions that are, going to support businesses on the ground in Scotland, and certainly skills is one of the key policy areas that sort of cuts through both, I guess. So investing in people and skills and trying to help businesses to be able to recruit, to attract into Scotland often as well, and retain and really get the most from their workforce. So certainly skills is critical, infrastructure, and that sort of policy view.
Great. We're getting a few questions in now from our audience. I'm going to come to them in a second just to reassure people who are typing away in the comments box. But I've got one more for you, Anna, just before we go to audience questions. And, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, you literally exist to argue for a more humane politics that puts people and communities first. Do you have a sense of hope about what you've heard so far in this election? Are you hoping for a bit more this week?
Yeah, hope might be going a bit far, but I think people say cautiously optimistic. So if we can go on the assumption that we're expecting a Labour victory in the election, I do think that the narrative around resetting politics, the recognition of the role of civil society and how important that is, and this emphasis on public services, then, and respect for devolution, indeed, I think that is hopeful. But there's no specifics, and that kind of worries me. The one specific that I have picked up is that a Labour government would stick with the 2-child benefit cap. I just think that it's economic madness, as well as it being, in my view, inhumane and unfair. At least the Lib Dems have said that they would scrap that. But the Westminster approach to social security from the current government, and indeed the Labour government before that, really perpetuates hardship. It stigmatises people who are not working, whatever reason that might be, and it ends up costing more. So people on benefits, for example, are not allowed to volunteer. There's lots of research that will tell you that helps build confidence, it helps build skills, and it's really good for people's mental health. My personal, not organisational, pet hate is the concept of no recourse to public funds, where people who come to the UK from abroad are not able to access anything that involves public expenditure here. And that might be fine for students coming from America to study at St Andrews, but it's absolutely not fine for asylum seekers, refugees, and people who the state are now currently deliberately making destitute. And even if you forget the humanity of that, it's really expensive.
And it's actually Refugee Week, as I'm sure you're more than well aware, and that will also be the theme of this week's Spotlight podcast. We've been running a series of election-themed podcasts, and the next edition will be out on Thursday with a particular focus on all these issues to do with refugees and migration more broadly. It's a great opportunity actually to bring in our first audience question, which is from Hannah. And Emily, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you here and then see who else would like to comment. But it's a general question about why aren't the political parties in Scotland talking more about migration in this election? And could you reflect a bit on the rhetoric and the manifesto positions of the big political parties when it comes to immigration and what the implications for this might be for Scotland? So open to all panellists to comment on that if they'd like to, but starting, if you don't mind, Emily, with yourself.
Yeah, sure. So if we start with where the public are on this, actually, in terms of public priorities, immigration tends to be lower down the list in terms of the Scottish public's priorities than it is UK-wide. And of course, there's been a very different context and a different public debate around migration in Scotland. Of course, there is less migration into Scotland in the first place compared to many other parts of the UK, and also parts of Scotland facing labour shortages and population decline. So it does. In terms of salience to voters, it is an issue that tends to come up more UK-wide, and it's also an issue that comes up for some groups more than others. So you tend to find that older age groups, people who voted Conservative at the last general election, and men are the most likely groups to mention immigration as a concern.
Nicola, I think you share a frustration that there hasn't been enough discussion really of some of these bigger global questions in the election. Why aren't we hearing more about perhaps the benefits of migration?
I think in part it's because in Scotland there isn't really a whole lot of difference between the parties on where they stand on immigration. They, they're broadly favourable to immigration and recognise the economic need for immigration for Scotland's workforce, but that's a difficult thing to raise on the doorsteps because although it's maybe not high up the list, more immigration is not really a priority for most voters either. So, and when they're not competing with each other on the issue, there's less of a need to raise it. And I think also in Scotland, you're not getting the same degree of pressure from the Reform Party as is evident in England. It's not removed. I mean, I noticed in some of the most recent polls that Reform were polling higher than the Greens in Scotland, so it's not totally absent from Scottish politics, but it doesn't have the same kind of salience. And I think there's a frustration with election campaigns about what counts as the issues that tend to emerge are the ones that are politically salient and electorally salient, where the parties are divided and they are contested. That doesn't always map onto the issues that we see as salient in terms of importance from a policy perspective, and particularly for the longer term. But if the parties themselves are broadly sharing the view that climate change is an issue and they need to do something about it, they're broadly sharing the view that public services are really difficult to sustain and there's something we need to do about the NHS in the longer term, but they don't have clear differences in their approach, then it tends not to come up in elections. And that's a frustration for many of us with a passion about public policy.
And Nathalie, just from the business community's perspective, I mean, we're very aware from our public discourse that there are industries in Scotland that are screaming out for inward migration to cover some of their desperate skills needs. Is there an appetite from the business community to talk about migration more, and perhaps the one we've not mentioned so far is the implications of Brexit on this election? Where do the business community stand on some of these big issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know in last year, the Scottish Government worked with James Withers on the Withers Review into the skills landscape across Scotland at a Scotland level. So I think business is really poised to see what comes next from that, because that made a large number of recommendations. So at the IOD, we're looking to see the next steps in terms of Withers. But also more broadly, so as you mentioned, there's some really key industries in Scotland, hospitality, agriculture, that are really looking for often seasonal workers, and that's really dampening growth opportunities. Businesses don't want to go and invest in extra bedrooms or more acres if they don't think that they're confident that they can skill that opportunity up. So whoever's in power at every level, skills and access to workforce is critically important.
Thank you. We've got another audience question about an issue which isn't getting covered, and that's climate change. This time around, I can reassure you, though, it will be a theme of our Spotlight podcast again, looking specifically at some of the issues there. Emily, if I could start with you on this, and then Anna, if you don't mind, come to you on some of the climate change questions here. But this is a question from Sarah Latto, and she says, I'm interested why addressing climate change isn't more of an election issue with the main parties, given the existential threat it poses in the long term. But she asks specifically, is this a reflection of the demographics of swing voters? So there's quite an interesting angle to that question about, are we seeing issues feature because they might determine votes more so than others?
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, if we look at where climate change and the environment sit in terms of public priorities, in recent years, it's always in the top 10, but usually sitting somewhere around 8th or 9th. And that, will come up more at, say if we're having a heat wave or if there's news about wildfires elsewhere in Europe and so on, then it jumps up the public agenda. But in terms of whether there are issues that just are not being talked about for that reason, again with climate change, I think that it's not being talked about as much at this election, and I think it will be interesting to see with the further manifestos coming out this week whether that changes at all.
I mean, I would like to suggest that perhaps that's because everything to do with climate change policy requires difficult, hard choices and government telling individuals some really hard truths. Anna, is that really perhaps what's going on here, that our politicians perhaps don't want to level with us on some of the big, hard questions that are coming up in the future?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And I also think it plays to what Nicola was saying earlier about people deal with the immediate. And it does feel more immediate if there's a flood or whatever, but actually it's like your too hard pile, when we've all got a too hard pile at work, haven't we, or even at home, where you don't do it because you need to take time, and it's much easier to just concentrate on the thing that you need to do today. But this is the most important thing facing us and facing the planet. This is, as Sarah said in her question, as an existential threat to all of us, and we really should be doing taking action and taking those hard decisions. And we know from all the research and all the evidence that it's people who are the poorest who will be most hit by climate change, whether that's in Global South or whether that's in our own communities. And there's lots of work going on in communities across Scotland, and voluntary organisations doing work on recycling, on helping people to learn how to mend clothes, for example, rather than buying new things, like lots of little things. And people think it's little things, but all those little things can add up. So we do need some big, hard decisions and some more than nudge from a government level, but we also need to help those little things happen across our communities.
Yeah, I think it's an issue you will hear much more about from whoever forms the next government post-election. I think the parties are perhaps a little nervous about talking about it during the campaign for just those reasons around, hard choices that could be unpalatable to voters.
Yeah, it actually features in the Institute of Directors manifesto for this election, calling for incentivization for businesses to take steps towards net zero. So looking at benefits for those that are investing, because as everyone said so far, there's so many challenges for businesses at the moment, and this doesn't always get to the top of the pile, but if we can bring it to the forefront, it'll make a big difference.
We're getting lots of questions now about different aspects of devolution. So Nicola, I hope you're ready, because they're all coming your way in a moment or two. But Anna, if I could just stick with you, because I want to pick up with something you said earlier, two remarks actually that you made earlier. One about the degree to which we're not talking about poverty and inequality, and that living in a more inclusive society is something that everyone benefits from, not just those who are most in need. And also the contribution that the third sector makes to economic growth more broadly. You've got me thinking about the extent to which we're not really talking about cost of living or even living standards in this election campaign. And I'm wondering if that's because everything's being geared towards the individual. We're in a really sort of retail politics orientated election. And I'm left a bit despondent thinking, does individualism kill altruism in election campaigns? Are we all just too self-motivated to care about that bigger picture?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to mention Margaret Thatcher. I think the root of all evil, basically. However, I think so. It's not a new thing, that individualism, but actually, it may be that the parties are all talking about will cut your tax, will not put up your tax. When if you speak to most people who earn a reasonable amount of money, they'll say they're quite happy for their taxes to go up a wee bit to pay for public services. But I think fundamentally, most people in Scotland or anywhere are not impacted that much by election campaigns, and they will remain broadly altruistic. We see lots of things happening in communities where people get together and do things. They do things for issues and topics and people and communities across the world, not just on their own front door. So I don't think it kills off altruism in human beings, but I think we do see quite a lot of that appeal to the individual in campaigning, but I don't think that's a new thing.
Okay, that's helpful. I want to move to devolution because we've had quite a few questions about this, and Nicola, just starting with you, we can bring up a question from AL that might put it best, but there's been a few others as well, including from Susan Murray, who's asked us about politicians and political parties deliberately confusing the electorate by mixing up what's devolved and reserved. But more specifically from AL, is it fair for unionists to decry devolved issues and for independent supporters to push reserved issues in a devolved election? Are we faced with a broad crisis of devolution here? And why aren't we educating the public on who's responsible for what?
So, I think it's the Scottish Social Attitude Survey that routinely asks people about where they think powers lie. And broadly, there is understanding that sort of powers for domestic things like the NHS and so on and education lie with the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. So I actually think there is quite a broad level of understanding. My take on these sorts of issues is that actually the electorate is a little bit more sophisticated than we're giving them credit for. In that, although some policy fields are devolved, they are also, the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government also operates within a multi-level political system where what it can and can't do is shaped by decisions taken at the UK government level, and that's more obvious in some policy areas than in others. And that's not to diminish the extent of policy making power and autonomy that the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament has, which is extensive, but it is a lot more complex, and it's made more complex now after the last revision to the devolution settlement and the tax and social security powers that came with that also brought more power, but brought more interdependence as well. And also Brexit. Brexit changed devolution fundamentally, and it changed the way that there are jagged edges between what is devolved and what is reserved. So I actually think that it is a lot more complex than simply a clear split between reserved and devolved policy areas anyway. Is that why the politicians are doing it? Of course not. They're doing it for political gain. And as my teenage daughter might say, the game's the game, right? So it's not unusual for politicians to use issues at one level to compete in an election at another. We've just had European Parliament elections last week. The UK used to compete in those. And frequently, they're actually more about national issues than European issues. You see that in local government elections here in Scotland as well. They might be about national issues or even UK issues, and vice versa. And that's just the nature of multi-level politics.
So a quick follow-up on that, and actually, Emily, I wondered if you wanted to add anything in a moment or two, but just picking up from a question from Joanna Barrett, who's in the audience, who's asking very specifically, developing this thought a bit further, how can she best lobby or influence, Nicola, prospective Scottish MPs and their parties in a general election when they won't necessarily have the levers of power over the things that they're talking about which affect their constituents? I find that really interesting. So the evolving role of MPs in a devolved context, where's their power and how should people approach them in that sense?
So I suppose it goes back to one of the earlier comments that was asking about what happens when you have a party with a massive majority in power, and that does change the balance of power between government and parliament anyway, even if you leave aside the devolution issue that's being asked about there. I think it's sometimes if it's constituency matters, then MPs will pass on to their MSP counterparts to deal with a constituency matter on a matter that is devolved. But when it's broader political issues, then these do come up in the UK Parliament, just as reserved policy areas come up for debate in the Scottish Parliament as well. So I think you can absolutely engage in UK-wide campaigns with your counterparts, but you have to lobby, I suppose, both sets. And something in public policy academic work, they talk a little bit about venue shopping when you have a multi-level system. So you can use that to put pressure on one government by lobbying those at another level. And so it does create more opportunities in a sense. Can be frustrating, but it creates more opportunities to try to get the points across. If you feel that you're not getting the points across to the people that have most of the levers of power, you can maybe use the others as leverage.
Emily, anything you'd like to add to that before we go to our final couple of questions?
Only that I would completely agree with Nicola that the electorate are more sophisticated than they're given credit for. And certainly it looks as if we're likely to see a lot of tactical voting again at this election. So I think just under a quarter of people say that they are going to vote for another party who aren't actually their preferred party, but to keep another party out locally at this election, and that is up 10 points since the last election in 2019. So, and of course, we saw more tactical voting at the last Scottish Parliament election as well, particularly on the Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem voters. So, I think that sophistication around how am I going to use my vote so that it kind of sends the message that I want it to. I think we're seeing much more of that than we used to.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left and two questions I want to get through. My final question is going to be asking you all to reflect on what you think a supermajority might mean for the future of British politics. So stew that one for a moment or two. And I'm going to start actually with my penultimate question with you again, Emily. And this comes from Ross Barclay, where he's reflecting about changing demographics and the influence on party manifestos and public finances more broadly. So, we think about the triple lock in particular, assuming that pensioners are more predisposed to vote than young people, so that gets more prominence in an election campaign. The parties have committed to that, but not necessarily policies for younger people. Who's going to talk about the fact that we have a shrinking tax base and how we're going to pay for all of these policies? Does that come through in any of the evidence, Emily?
Yeah, it does. So across the board, as I say, like whatever the age group, people agree that the NHS is the top priority at this election. But then beyond that, you do see, the oldest age group more concerned around pensions. As you say, you've seen that come through during the campaign already. And then the youngest age group more concerned about housing and taxation. And we've not necessarily seen housing come up to the same extent. So I'm sure that there is an element of that.
Thank you. And let's just go to that final round of houses on a supermajority. That's the warning, I think we heard from Grant Shapps over the past couple of days, a sense that Labour might have such a significant lead that they could be sitting on a majority of 200 plus MPs. Now, other polls are available pointing to slightly different results, but what might that mean for the future of politics? Starting with you, Nathalie, and then Anna.
Yeah, so probably less challenge for government, which maybe is not a great thing. It's always probably good for government to have a strong opposition and be held to account on every topic, really. But certainly the business community, I think we would like to see an opposition party that's able to challenge government.
Anna, would you be hoping for a bolder government with a majority like that?
I would be hoping for, but I think that would mean we probably wouldn't get a bolder government because, as Nathalie said, then there's no challenge. If you think about, I think there was a halcyon moment in politics in Scotland in 2007, just after the election, where we had a minority government who had to negotiate and had to come to a consensus. It was slightly hampered, with all due respect, Kez, to your past life, by the majority consisting for a while of just Annabel Goldie, because everyone else was too busy licking their wounds and not really knowing what was going on. But I think something that comes with more consensus, it might be good for a wee while when they're putting through lots of things, but I think mainly actually what really makes a good government is a good opposition.
Emily, do we know anything about how the public might respond to a government with untrammelled power like that?
I think it remains to be seen, but what I would say on the supermajorities, I think in the race in Scotland, I'd say there's still a lot of uncertainty actually, and because you have so many marginal seats in Scotland, even quite small movements in vote share could lead to kind of a lot of change in terms of the number of seats that each party picks up. Particularly thinking about whether we might see change from movement to Labour from the SNP across the Central Belt. So I think certainly from where I sit, it feels too early to be talking about a supermajority.
Thank you. And Nicola, what takeaways are political scientists considering with the prospect of a supermajority?
I suppose on the idea should enable and empower a government to make radical, bold change that it might otherwise not be prepared to do. But there's every indication from the Labour manifesto, and that is the party that we're talking about here, that suggests that there may be cautious about making some of those kinds of bold changes. And perhaps once you're elected, you might look ahead to the next election and hope for re-election and not want to sort of rock the boat in a sense. But I think a lot of the opposition, there are set piece movements in the Parliament that will enable people to raise questions, whether it's a 50 majority or a 200 majority. They'll still have to go through those motions. And the public, I don't think, are overly reliant on individual members of Parliament. They will be vocal anyway, I think, if they want to challenge the government of the day. And just if I can make one final point, there's been so much emphasis on change. So that's absolutely the central message of the Labour manifesto and of the Labour campaign. It's about change. The second page of the manifesto is like change wallpaper, right? And as an election campaign tool, that's enormously effective because it doesn't mean anything, or it means whatever anybody frustrated with the way things are wants it to mean. But it's not a terribly effective tool for governing, because governing, to go back to your point, Kez, means making difficult choices. And difficult choices means that some people gain and some people lose. And I think that's where you will start to see frustrations re-emerging in due course. There's not a whole lot of money for the government to play with, unless it makes some difficult choices there too. And I think you will see opposition possibly internally from within the Labour group in due course, but also more wider from other parties and from the public.
It's certainly the case, and that's a very big backbench of Labour MPs for them to be dealing with. Thank you most sincerely to all of our guests for joining us for Policy Insights Live today. That's all we have time for.